I do want to thank all of our facilitators and presenters who have worked so hard to get this semester well underway or well prepared. And especially for today, we want to thank Diane Haynes, who is not with us, but also our hero, Dick Martin, who has done everything for us. So all of our tips and tricks and all of our recording, and he's our Superman. So this morning, I would like to introduce Deborah Dean, who is going to introduce our program for today and our presenter for today. So Deborah Dean.
Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to have real people in this room. My name's Deborah Dean, and I was asked to fill in for Diane Haynes as facilitator today. She's temporarily away from Okemuk. So I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to see people without masks. My husband, Robert, and I moved in February of 2020, so we're fairly recent. And it's just a wonderful experience now to have Adventures in Living starting back up again. So we thank Dick Martin again for all his work. And I got to know Alice, and that was a real plus. By way of introduction, Alice Gridley moved to Okemuk in 2008, and she was primarily in business education in her earlier years, but I had a wonderful talk with her about a month ago and got to know her a little bit better. She's very soft-spoken, very self-deprecating, as you well know, and she had a fantastic career with IBM for many years, and I was so impressed. She has a BS from Hardwick College in Oneida, New York. She's lived in Massachusetts, New York, and Boca Raton, Florida. She's a photographer, environmentalist, enjoys politics, we all do, reading, biking, and daydreaming. And I realized we have things in one other thing that Alice recently has done is become a published author. If anybody gets the New York Times this last Sunday in the magazine, there was a letter from Alice Gridley that was published in relation, in relation to a wonderful article about 2 weeks ago that featured a grown man who was looking for his seafaring father, who had been in and out of his life periodically. And Alice wrote in response to reading the article, the long magazine article, this photograph on page 29 of them hugging put me over the edge. Life's trials can be a springboard to an interesting, compassionate life. This talented young man has good instincts and has chosen his path wisely. So that was the gist of her letter, which I thought was wonderful. So I encourage you to read the article a couple of weeks ago and see Alice's response to it. One thing I learned by talking with her was that we have some things in common, but one that stood out was the fact that we took the same sailing course, the Steve Colgate offshore sailing course many years ago, and were both petrified during that week. Now, Alice took her fear and turned it into a real adventure. And that's the gist, I think, primarily of what we're going to see. So Alice, would you come up?
Thank you, Debbie. You don't know it, but I thoroughly enjoyed meeting you too. She's wonderful. And for those of you who are thinking that you might want to do an Adventures in Living, please do it. And Dick Martin needs the work. And so does Julianne. But I can see that this is a motley crowd right here in the Oak Room. So we're locking the doors so you can't leave. And I also welcome the people on Zoom. Thanks so much.
In Okemuk for 13 years now, and I've survived. So I just would like to share with you a little bit, a sliver of my life, and I entitled it Lucky in Life. I'll start with my mother. My mother was Mary Carter, born in Milledgeville, North Carolina in 1907. It was a mill town, and her parents had come there from Massachusetts for the work. Unfortunately, my grandmother died the day my mother was born. And by the way, I did not know that until I started doing this research. So I'm indebted to Dick and to Diane for getting me started on this. She left my grandfather with 4 young children and a newborn baby to manage. He went on to marry 2 more times, each time having large families. My father was Ralph Nutter Sullivan, born in Beverly, Massachusetts in 1902. He was a carpenter by trade and served in the Navy Seabees during World War II. They married in 1933, and I'd like to share a quote that I found on the internet about those times. The 1930s were turbulent times, to say the least. As the decade is rung in, the country is still reeling from the 1929 stock market crash. The effects of the crash would linger throughout the decade. It ends with the invasion of Poland in the fall of 1939. Many of you know that the 1930s were tough times. Unemployment was high, the Dust Bowl was underway, and there were troubling signs of war in Europe. My father's parents were well off, but my father was out of work. So my parents lived for a time with his parents. Because of religious differences, Dad's Protestant family and Mom's Catholic family, they did not trust each other. In spite of it all, my parents had 3 children. My older brother Ralph in 1934, he later became a physicist. Me in 1937, and my younger brother Joe in 1940. He later founded an internationally known company for the blind. I was born in Boston's St. Evangeline Hospital for Unwed Mothers. My mother was married, but my parents were poor. She may not have been able to go elsewhere. That hospital no longer exists. During World War II, their marriage fell apart. They separated, and my mother, with 3 small children, moved in with her sister, my Aunt Alice, in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And yes, I was named for her. The first floor apartment was in a 3-decker in a working class neighborhood. I never had a photo of my decker, but this is an internet photo typical of that era. In addition to the 4 of us, Aunt Alice was supporting her brother. She worked for her father's cousin, Mayor Michael Curley, who later became governor of Massachusetts. She would often offer to take one of us kids to the office with her when she went in on weekends. My brother Ralph said she'd ask my mother, "Who would you like me to take?" And my mother would always answer, "Take Alice." I was a little hard to keep track of. You've heard of the terrible twos. Well, that extended until I was 5. But you have to take my brother's memory of me with a grain of salt, because when we were young, we were usually at war. In the spring of 1943, I was 5, and my father was on the west coast of the U.S., serving in the Seabees. He was notified that my mother died from pneumonia. It was a very short illness. In those days, there was no penicillin. He returned to Dorchester and was faced with what to do with 3 kids under 8 years old. My younger brother and I were taken in by 2 different family members. I was with Dad's cousin Roger and his wife Kay in nearby Beverly. Kay was long on love, thank goodness, but short on discipline. I ate what I wanted, which was coffee and Boston baked beans. You can imagine. I was in 1st grade and a Catholic school was across the street, yet I was late for school every day. The 1st grade teacher, a nun, would not put up with such nonsense and sent me to the cloakroom every time I was late. She never knew I loved it. While my classmates were working, I could daydream all I wanted. I'd like to believe that year helped develop my imagination. My grandmother on Dad's side stepped in, and the next thing I knew, I was on the way to live with another of Dad's cousins, May and her husband, Wilbur, on Long Island. Unable to have children, each of them had lost a parent when they were very young, so they related to my situation. They treated me as their own. I soon saw them as Mom and Dad. May was the 11th of 13 children. She was born in 1904 on a farm in New Brunswick, Canada. May was only 3 when her father died. Her mother was pregnant with their 13th child. There were 10 girls and 3 boys. Everyone pitched in to care for the little ones and tended the farm. On top of that, May's mother foster cared for 2 orphaned boys. Each of those boys eventually married one of May's sisters when they came of age. In the late 1920s, May became a beautician at a salon on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And along the way, she met Wilbur. Wilbur was born in 1907 on Long Island. His father was a local businessman and mayor of the town. Wilbur's mother died when he was 5 and left an inheritance for Wilbur and his younger brother. When he was old enough and learned to fly, he used his inheritance to buy a plane. Airplanes were so rare in those days that he made local headlines when he buzzed low over his hometown. I was 6 when I came to live with May and Wilbur. World War II was raging, food was rationed, anything made from steel was hard to come by. They took a big chance with a scrawny kid in immediate need of medical attention, healthy nourishment, and no-nonsense guidance. They had a victory garden, and every dinner included vegetables, exactly what I needed. In September '44, 3 months after I first met them, they signed adoption papers. I could not have picked better parents. My new mom welcomed any schoolmate I brought home for lunch, and Dad was the dad that drove not only me, but my friends home after endless school events. He knew each of my friends by where they lived. Dad was a man of few words. He never told me that he had learned to fly and once owned a plane, or that he was at Grumman Field when Lindbergh took off for the first transatlantic flight. But there were many Sunday afternoons when we'd drive to LaGuardia or Idlewild, later renamed Kennedy, just to see the planes and the international passengers arriving or leaving. Is it any wonder that I wanted to be an airline stewardess? But I can still see Dad across the kitchen table when I made that announcement. His quiet words were wise and well chosen. You can be a stewardess after you go to college. Advice I still treasure. I was accepted at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, and I signed up for a journalism course. A few months later, the course was abruptly canceled. I never knew exactly why, and I wound up at a small Lutheran college upstate New York, Hartwick College in Oneonta. They cobbled together a curriculum that led to my becoming a business teacher. Hartwick is where I met my first husband, Merritt Little. We eloped in my sophomore year. I didn't expect it, but my parents looked past their keen disappointment and continued to pay for my college bills. As Merritt was a year ahead of me, I took additional classes and went to summer school to graduate a year early. At the same time, we both had part-time jobs. I pity the poor college professor who had me for a secretary, as I was still learning to type. After our college graduation, we moved to the small New York town of Owego, halfway between New York City and Buffalo, and just north of Scranton. With only a basic degree in psychology, Merritt was unable to find a job in the field, so he went to work for his parents in their funeral business. I worked for a few years teaching and managing the office in a business school in Binghamton, New York. I loved teaching and the students. Many students were vets returning from the Korean War and on the GI Bill. In 1959, my daughter April was born. Although the marriage to Merritt later failed, April has always been the brightest light of my life. I should mention here that my mother was terrified of flying, and was probably the reason that Dad sold his cherished plane before they married. But a day after April was born, my parents flew up to see her in a friend's tiny private plane. It was probably like riding on a bucking bronco. In today's world, with flying so commonplace, it's hard to imagine how much courage it took for Mom to step foot in that plane, not only flying to Owego, but flying home to Long Island again. In 1963, I applied at IBM. Their Federal Systems branch was located in Owego. Secretarial positions were the only openings IBM had at the time. Shortly after I was hired, all hiring across the 5,000-person site was shut down. About a dozen other secretaries and I were in the secretarial pool for at least a year. Every day we'd be assigned to departments in need of a secretary: engineering, programming, marketing, finance, purchasing, manufacturing, and administrative areas. The site's main responsibility was for onboard computers for our country's space shots. We had other government onboard computer programs as well, such as for the stealth bomber. It was inspiring work. I thoroughly enjoyed getting to know the nature of the work in various areas and met most of the management team. All but 2 of the 450 managers were males. In the late 1960s, I became the 3rd female manager at IBM Owego. The experience that I had in the secretarial pool was invaluable. And in management positions, along with the help of equal opportunity, I was fortunate to be able to offer other women and minorities meaningful career paths. I won't bore you with stories of my 28 years with IBM, but there was one project I think you will find interesting. The site general manager asked if I would take responsibility for a site-wide quality program. This was in addition to the quality department in manufacturing, but quite different, as it applied to everyone from receptionists to those in management. Of course, I said yes and thought I'd just need a few weeks to develop it. As I delved into the work of quality gurus like Deming and Duran and researched methods that worked or fizzled at other companies, I knew that if I taught the management team, the concepts would quickly peter out. The teachers of each management area had to be their own high-level managers who reported directly to the general manager. When I decided to make the proposal to the general manager that I would be facilitator and upper-level managers would do the actual teaching, I was worried. But he immediately grasped how effective that would be and supported the recommendation. It was one of the most challenging and interesting projects of my career. Although Bob and I were acquainted through our jobs at IBM, we became friends through tennis. Bob had 3 children, and now their families are an important part of my life. Bob and I were married in 1981, and 2 years later transferred with IBM to Boca Raton. My personal life took a new direction: sailing. I had a lot of powerboat experience growing up on the South Shore of Long Island, but had never been on a sailboat. Bob grew up sailing and racing on Lake Erie. Little did I know the changes that were coming, especially after taking sailing lessons on a 16-foot sunfish. Those of you who sail know the thrill of skimming across the water while hanging onto a line, hoping you can avoid a spill when the wind suddenly shifts, as it eventually will. There's nothing like it. well, maybe there is something, but that's for another story. We had done a lot of traveling and especially enjoyed bareboat sailing in the Virgin Islands. On one trip, we were with another couple and rented a cruising sailboat and dinghy from the American Virgin Islands. On the third night, we decided to anchor on the outer edge of a bay on the north shore of St. John in the British Virgin Islands. It was a warm, muggy night, and there were far too many mosquitoes close to shore. So we anchored on the very outer edge. Everyone had fallen asleep, but I was too warm and decided to sleep on a bench in the cockpit. Around 2 a.m., I felt the boat bump something. I sat up thinking we had dragged anchor. We hadn't. And then I noticed a small open boat close to our stern. There were 3 men, all dressed in black, complete with black wool caps. My first thought was they had come to warn us about something, but that thought quickly left, as when they saw me, they started whispering to each other. I waited warily. Finally, one said in a heavy island accent, "You have gas? We outgas." I said, "No, we have no gas to spare." With that, Bob came up the companionway and asked, "Who are you talking to?" "Them," I said, and pointed. When they saw Bob, they quickly cranked up their outboard motor and took off like a shot. They did not know if we had guns. We never carried guns. Afterward, we tried to notify authorities on the ship's radio, but we had no response. We debated what they were after, our jerry cans that were splashed to the deck, or the motor off our dinghy cleated to the stern. We had our answer when we tuned in the radio in the morning. In the nearby bay, thieves had stolen a dinghy, an outboard motor from a cruising boat. Then we knew exactly what happened. They had clumsily bumped our boat when they attempted to uncleat our dinghy. It was pure luck that I was on deck and that Bob came up when he did. In 1993, we bought our first sailboat suitable for cruising, a used 34-foot Irwin. It had a 3.5-foot keel, just the right size for us and the shallow waters around the Keys and the Bahamas. Bob loved to skipper and I loved to navigate. Armed with a Loran and dozens of charts, we planned to cruise and race every chance we had. We loved going on trips to the Keys and Bahamas, and one memorable trip was crossing from Miami to Bimini on the way to the Exumas. As we pulled into the dock near Bimini Customs Office, we were pretty tired from a full day of crossing the Gulf Stream, and I wanted to stay on the dock overnight. Bob wanted to anchor somewhere nearby, but reluctantly agreed. He left the boat to check us into customs. I noticed a boat tied up across the dock from us. It was an old power boat, about 40 foot long, and painted completely black. All the portholes were covered. It was in poor shape and looked abandoned. No one was in sight. Nearby, there was a woman relaxing on her sailboat. We chatted pleasantly about the weather, and I learned she was a single-handed sailor and permanently lived on her boat. She then cautioned me to be careful around the black boat. "What's the story?" I asked. She said the night before, the people on the boat were blasting music long after midnight. An elderly couple docked nearby, and the man approached the black boat. He politely asked the occupants to turn the music down. The people on the boat were belligerent, and with a threat to shoot a hole in the old man's boat, one man pushed the old one in the water. In those days, after customs office closed, there was no one on the docks to provide protection. I told the woman that I appreciated the heads up and that we would not be staying overnight after all. I was concerned about her safety and offered to have her join us anchoring elsewhere, but she simply said, "I have a gun." When Bob returned to our boat, he was puzzled at my change of heart, but readily agreed when he heard the story. In 1998, we bought a 35-foot Beneteau, the boat of our dreams. We had the dealer set it up so we'd be self-sufficient on long cruises. When we bought the boat, we thought the mechanical troubles we were having with our old sailboat were over. We made arrangements with the Bradenton salesman to exchange boats in the Keys, Marathon. The moment we spotted the new Indigo tied to the dock, we could not wait to take her out to see if she performed as promised. After transferring our supplies and sailing gear, we took off for a vacation, planning to go as far as the Dry Tortugas, 70 miles west of Key West. The helm was light to the touch and made me feel like a feather as we skipped through the waves. Imagine our surprise when we heard some unusual noises from the motor, just short of our Key West interim destination. We were able to limp into a marina at Stock Island. After an inspection, the mechanic, in a flat, indifferent tone, said the part was incorrectly installed, would have to be replaced, the new part ordered, and it'll take several days. We settled in. Unlike colorful and lively Key West, Stock Island was austere and all business. The docks bordered a treeless parking lot and several buildings. A nearby restaurant at first glance gave us hope, but had long been closed. Our view across the main canal was of Key West power generating site, power lines, and off to the left, several huge rotund fuel tanks. With nothing to do, I started exploring the docks. I soon met a young woman, Sally, a liveaboard sailor. She spent much of her free time rescuing cats, having them fixed, nursing them back to health, and then finding them homes. She managed to mask her disappointment that I was not a candidate to adopt, as I had allergies. We bonded over shopping for cat food. The second night we were at the dock, Bob and I were sleeping soundly. Around 3 a.m., we awoke to a deep boom. I sat up. What was that? And then another boom. Louder. I was out of bed and up the companionway in seconds. The black sky was lit up, shooting flames directly across the canal. Silhouetted by the flames, I could see 2 fuel trucks, both in flames, people running back and forth and yelling in futile attempts to help. I was very frightened, realizing if the fuel tanks a short distance from the fire caught, most of Stock Island and a part of Key West would be toast. We were stuck. Our boat had no power. We didn't have bikes. There was no way to outrun fuel tank explosions. I sat on the edge of the dock. My only game plan, if the sight blew, was to jump in the water. Not the best plan, as fuel in the water would certainly be on fire, shades of the Cleveland River. Mesmerized by the scene before me, I was glad Sally sat down next to me. Her quiet presence was comforting. Neither of us mentioned our fear of the fire spreading. Ash was falling, our boats were soon coated. We waited and waited for help to arrive. After what was probably about 25 minutes, the volunteer fire trucks appeared. Key West was saved, and I bet many slept through that night, never knowing the narrow escape. Now, you were probably wondering what my husband and Sally's significant other were doing while we watched on the dock. If you guessed still in the sack, you'd be right. They had gone back to their bunks and closed their eyes to the troubles outside. Who am I to say that's not the best way? Few wrinkles. The next day, we washed the boat down while the new part was installed. We decided against going to the Dry Tortugas and took off for home as soon as we could. A day later, we finally obtained a local newspaper and sadly learned the truck driver in the first explosion had died, probably immediately. This time we were tied up at the dock in Isla Morada. Believe it or not, the part installed in Stock Island had failed also. But unless you think our sailing lives were spent facing only problems, let me tell you about a fun time with our sailing club. We were invited to a Halloween party at a home in Lighthouse Point. Another couple suggested that we check out an ad in Pompano offering bridesmaids dresses for $25 each. You can imagine what they look like. We convinced a third couple to join us, and we planned to go as bridesmaids. The night we tried on dresses at the seller's house was one of the funniest nights of my life. You haven't lived until you see three guys, all 6 foot or more, and in the 200-pound range, trying on pink dresses with yards of long, stiff tulle skirts above their size 12 sneakers. After adding a few wigs, heavy makeup, and pearls, we were all set. That's me in the lower right and Bob in the back on the with the purple. I guess that was a wig, yeah. The night of the event, we got lost in Lighthouse Point, so we stopped at a 7-Eleven. One of the guys and I hopped out to go in and ask directions. With both of us in full regalia, nobody in the store batted an eyelash. This was South Florida after all. We were late and made quite an entrance when we arrived. We had one more surprise before the party wound down. We quietly went and stood by the pool. You know where this is going. Upon a signal, we all fell backwards into the pool. I thought those dresses would be a tangled mess when they dried, but they turned out better than new. I think those dresses were made of iron and are still surviving out there somewhere. Thank you for your patient attention to my slice of life, and I'd just like to ask if there are any questions.
Are there any questions on Zoom or from our audience? Alice is happy to answer any questions. Alice, do you want to come back here behind the camera?
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Did you sell the boat after that trip with the motor keep failing? Did you sell it after that?
No, we had it for about 5 or 6 years after that. And fortunately, when we had it fixed in Marathon, they did a great job. Thank you. You do wonder why we kept going out.
I have a question. What year was the fire in Stock Island about?
Well, I think I'd have to look it up for you, Joan, but I think it was in the late 1990s. I think we bought the boat in 98.
What was your scariest time on the boat or any of the boats?
Good question, John. This is a setup call. Whoops. Probably the scariest time was when we had the old boat and we were going out to a race and we were leaving the Boca Inlet. Now, the Boca Inlet is one of the worst inlets in Florida, mainly because the sandbars around it keep shifting. And it's also a dog leg. And as we made the left-hand turn to head to the open ocean, I realized that the waves that were coming into shore were much different than what we normally saw. There was a hurricane about 100 miles offshore, and we thought it would not bother us. We were wrong. So the waves were hitting pretty hard. And I said to Bob, we can't go out, we've got to go back. But actually there was no room to turn around in the inlet. Also, he was looking straight ahead and he was seeing that the inlet looked calm. Well, a huge wave came in. Ironically, it was one of the few times we hadn't put on life jackets before we came out, and there wasn't time enough to get them. So I hunkered down behind the bulkhead, and what happened was the wave didn't break, but we rose up over the top and down the back side into the trough. and we hit bottom really hard. And to a point where I thought momentarily we were stuck. But the next wave lifted us again and out we went. Well, we didn't go to the race that day. We went down to the Hillsborough Inlet, which had a different shaped uh, entrance, and we went in that particular inlet. But the next time we took our boat out, we found out the hard way that sand had gotten in the drive shaft, and so we had to be towed in on that time. Thank you, John.
Alice, how did you find landlocked Oak Hammock?
Well, that's very funny. We were getting the Fort Lauderdale newspaper, and believe it or not, the members here really made the difference because there was a story. It was not an advertisement. It was a story about Oak Hammock's people and what volunteer work they were doing. And it was everything from artists to volunteering at Prains Prairie to woodwork shop. And I looked at my husband when I read that and I said, this place is live wire. We need to check it out. And it didn't hurt that my daughter only lives an hour and a half away. So the combination of those two plus global warming really triggered our move. But thanks for asking that question.
Alice, I know you're very involved in civil rights and um, trying to make life better for people in and in the environmental work. Where did all this start and how? I think you were active long before you came to Oak Hammock.
Thank you for asking that question. I think it goes back to my interest in a women's shelter in Delray Beach. And I volunteered there for a while. But what triggered my interest in the detention center in McClenny, and if you haven't heard about it, there's a detention center about an hour and a half from here. It's up closer to Jacksonville. And ICE had put up to 250 people there. And it really was a tough situation because they had very poor food. They had no outside access at all. And most of the ICE people that were there had done nothing wrong. They had lived in the country for decades and quietly worked and had families. So piece of my heart was up there. Of course, during COVID, we couldn't go, but things may change in the future. We understand the woman who worked on that the most was a woman named Joan Anderson. She lives here in Gainesville, and a wonderful woman, and she's been doing it for 5 or 6 years. And she quietly kept talking to the sheriff about creating an outside access for the detainees. And I just found out yesterday that they did do that after all those years. And it was really mainly to her quiet activism. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.